Hi, and welcome to the And One podcast. I am your host, Alex West, and today I'm joined by Josh Cornelissen, writer for Hoops Habit, writer for 94 Feet Report, and panelist on the YouTube NBA discussion show, The Swingmen. He joins us today to talk about the Western Conference playoffs, or the brawl that is going on between 8 teams for the last 6 seeds. We talk about all these 8 teams. Josh is a wonderful guest. He does great work. He does great prep. So I really enjoy doing this podcast. Make sure to give him a follow on Twitter at Xavier Star, and make sure to read everything that he is writing. He writes about the Milwaukee Bucks. He also writes about the NBA in general. So follow him up. All right, Brent, take us away. I want to welcome my guest today, Josh Cornelissen. Josh, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. We had a great weekend of basketball from
Yes, we did.
Boston, Houston to Duke crushing the North Carolina Tar Heels. And then, you had that awesome game, the process dying to Giannis on Sunday. So it was a lot of fun for basketball this weekend.
Yes, it was. Across many levels. I mean, DeAndre Ayton had a fantastic game for Arizona this weekend. But we have something very important to talk about, and we're on a little bit of a time crunch. So let's jump right into it. We want to talk about the Western Conference playoffs, but I don't want to talk about Golden State. I don't want to talk about Houston. It's those next 8 teams: Portland, New Orleans, Minnesota, Oklahoma City, San Antonio, the LA Clippers, Denver, and Utah that are the most interesting to me, because honestly, Josh, I can't remember a playoff race where it was this close this late. Can you?
I really can't. And what really stands out to me is it's not just like, okay, it's really tight for the 7th and 8th seeds. Like Portland was almost out of the playoffs, a couple weeks ago, and now they're in 3rd, and it's the exact opposite for San Antonio. So everything is so volatile. I can't picture a year where the 3rd seed was at risk of falling out of the playoffs entirely. Like that's just crazy to me at this point in the year.
Yeah, there are 4 games that separate the Portland Trailblazers in the 3rd seed from the Utah Jazz in the 10th seed. So obviously, with about 20 games to go for every team, it is going to be vitally important to win this. So let's go through and talk about this. Let's start with Portland. Portland's a pretty good – they've played pretty well lately. They're 8-2 in their last 10. They've won 6 in a row. They're starting to look like a formidable team, and they've jumped up into the 3rd seed. What do you think about Portland right now?
I don't know what to think about Portland, because this is a team that's had an identity under Damian Lillard where they're going to be offensively explosive. They've got one of the most dynamic backcourts in the entire league with Damian Lillard and C.J. McCollum. And offense is supposed to be their calling card. Their coach, that's been his focus as well. And so you think that this team has an identity, and then this year they come in and their offense is mediocre and their defense is dominant. For the year, they've got the 7th best defense, but over their last 15 games, they've even moved up to the 5th best defense. So they're continuing that trend throughout the entire year. Something has changed, and I don't honestly know what it is. So it's really hard to evaluate whether they have staying power. But I will point out 538, their ELO rankings, has Portland 4th best in the entire league on the season. And now that, kind of weights it towards the recency. And Portland's riding a 6-game win streak that's raised them up the standings. But I think that tells us that they're not just beating bad teams. They're beating good teams, and they're really winning games well. So maybe this is for real.
I don't know. That's the thing. Because like you said, there's this really interesting dynamic of all of a sudden this is an offensive-minded team for the past few years, going back to that playoff series that they had with Houston a couple of years ago where Lillard makes the big 3 and all that. And this is a team that has ridden their offense as far as they've gotten. And then all of a sudden they switch gears. But not only have they switched gears, I mean, there's no one person that you can point to on this roster and say, there's your Marcus Smart level defender. There's not one guy who's just locking people out. This is a total team effort, and it's completely baffling to me where it came from. Nurkic is obviously a pretty good defender. I mean, he does a good deal of work for this team, but by no means is he a Rudy Gobert or anything like that.
No, you're absolutely right. And offensively, he's taken a step backwards from his hot end of the season last year. So really all the offensive production is coming from the wings. Lillard, McCollum, and even Shabazz Napier who, LeBron is probably crying to see him doing so well, but wanting him on his own team all those years ago. But, they've got basically 3 point guards that are generating like all the offensive production for this team. And Nurkic is just kind of there on offense, but defensively, he really seems to be making a difference. And I think underrated has also been the contributions of rookie Zach Collins. Now, his box score stats aren't there, but if you just use the eye test, he's hustling. He's getting there. He's moving his feet. His hands are everywhere. He's poking balls away. He's diving for loose balls, and I think that's really helped this team on the margins. And so when you have young players like Collins and Nurkic who are playing hard, and you've got a leader like Lillard who's like going to just inspire everyone to just play as well as they can. I think that that's kind of the secret to the success here for Portland. And I don't think, you can overlook how good of a season that Damian Lillard is having. I think that has to be highlighted. I mean, he has a legitimate shot at making an all-NBA team. I mean, he's averaging 26.4 points per game, 6.5 assists, 4.5 rebounds, a steal, and he's shooting 91% from the free throw line on a lot of attempts. So he's really making it happen from all areas of the court, and I think that really deserves to be acknowledged.
Interesting that you brought up Zach Collins. I was watching the Oklahoma City game just honestly right before we went on, and the thing that stood out to me was in the critical minutes of this game, they had elected to go with Ed Davis and or Nurkic, a little bit rotating that, but then Zach Collins playing the 4, and Collins played tremendously well in that game. And this is a pick that even I myself was pretty down on last summer, but all of a sudden he starts to look like a pretty quality rotation player, and perhaps even more than that. So it's very interesting that you brought up his name because I had that written down as well as something to talk about. And when it comes to Lillard and McCollum, when you have two guys who can make shots, I wrote an article earlier this year about the Northwest and what a brutal division it was going to be this year. And I really thought that Portland was going to pull this division out, and it's on the backs of having two shot makers because it's so important in the playoffs, and apparently now the playoffs have started for the Western Conference. But in the playoffs, it's so important to have guys who can get their own buckets, and the Trailblazers have two of those guys.
Yeah, they really do. And as much as we talk about Lillard, we don't talk about McCollum. We really should be talking about McCollum. And then when McCollum's hot, we talk about him and we forget Lillard. But both of these guys are dynamic. I would have to say they're both top 10 as far as offensive production from the backcourt. And, now that we're into March, everybody's getting excited for March Madness and the tournament coming up. One of the secrets to success, if you're not just stacked with, All-Americans, is you get a hard-nosed defensive team with one or two guys that can just go out and make buckets. Napier was on such a team at UConn. Kemba Walker was as well. You see a number of these teams. That's kind of what Portland's designed here. They've got a bunch of guys who don't need shots, Al-Farouq Aminu, Collins, Yusuf Nurkic, Ed Davis, who are just going to defend and work hard around Lillard and McCollum, and then those two guys are just going to go out and get shots. And I don't know who's going to be able to stop them. So now, obviously, they're not scoring at a super high level. They're middle of the pack in offense, but it's working. And, I mean, the proof's in the pudding.
Yeah, that's totally right. My dad has always said that NCAA games rise and fall on guard play, and this seems to be the formula. I mean, this slow it down, grind it out formula with two guys who can get buckets is something that has worked historically for other teams, and it seems to be working for the Portland Trailblazers now. So let's move on and talk about the fourth place team. They're probably the second hottest team in the league right now behind the Rockets, and that's the New Orleans Pelicans. They've won 8 straight games. They're 8-2 over their last 10, and they've moved into the 4th seed. And let's just put it out there, Josh. This discussion begins and ends with Anthony Davis and the way he's played lately since DeMarcus Cousins' rupture of his Achilles tendon.
You are absolutely right. Anthony Davis is everything to this team. And I don't want to put down Drew Holiday's contributions, and I'm sure we'll touch on him in a minute. But what Anthony Davis has been doing is incredible. He's basically embraced the role he was playing earlier in the season and the role DeMarcus Cousins was playing in the season. He's handling the ball more. He's posting up inside. He's attacking the rim. And I think what's interesting is that over the win streak, Anthony Davis has actually shifted inside the arc a lot more. And I know, the modern NBA, we're talking about centers need to shoot from outside to have value. And that's something Cousins was doing. And even Davis has done more and more over his career. And he is shooting about 2 threes a game overall for the season. But when he had that massive game, just a couple of nights ago, where he dropped 53 points and 18 rebounds, he didn't get any points from beyond the arc. He was 16 of 29 from inside the arc, 21 of 26 from the line, which 21 made free throws. But he didn't, make a single three-pointer. And I think this is the role where Anthony Davis can really be different. I think there's a lot of guys coming into the league that can kind of shoot the three if they need to. But Anthony Davis is truly special inside the arc. And I think the more the Pelicans embrace that, the more they're going to continue to find success.
It's interesting. Earlier in the year, this was a team that was shooting the three ball tremendously well. Now, they've sort of regressed to the mean. They're the 15th best, according to Basketball Reference today. They're the 15th best three-point shooting percentage team at 36.3. And that's sort of been the identity problem with this team, or I guess not necessarily a problem, but this is the issue that people thought they would have, is they don't have a tremendous amount of shooters to go around Anthony Davis. So it is interesting that you say, Davis has shifted inside the arc. And they're not, they're not killing it around him with the rest of the guys, but you do have some decent shooters in Nikola Mirotic, who hasn't shot as well as he did with the Bulls when he was shooting that ridiculous 46% or whatever. But you've got E'Twaun Moore, you've got Drew Holiday, you've got just a couple of guys who can knock down big shots, and then of course you had Cousins earlier in the year, who was a very underrated three-point shooter. So it's interesting to see how they've shifted the dynamic of this team to this sort of freewheeling team that they were, to now slowing it down, focusing on getting Anthony Davis as many touches as he can, and how that's kind of elevated this team. What do you think that means for this team going into the playoffs, and maybe going into the discussion of what's going to become of DeMarcus Cousins?
I think what is working best for New Orleans is an identity where you have a guard who's playing really well in Drew Holiday and a big who's playing really well in Anthony Davis. They are finding the best success of the entire season right now. But I don't think that means that there isn't room for a guy like Cousins. I will say that, 8-game win streak, it's certainly excellent. But here are their kind of metrics over that win streak. They're only fourth in the league in net rating, despite being undefeated over the last 8 games. And they're 8th in offense and 8th in defense over that span. So it's not like they're just destroying teams on either end. They're just above average in both cases, and it's ended up winning them a lot of games. And 538 only has them 12th in the entire league right now in ELO rating. So they're not necessarily buying that this is something sustainable as well. So I think to suggest that because Anthony Davis being Superman and everybody else playing well enough has equaled a lot of wins, I don't think that means that this is the formula that's going to work necessarily moving forward. I think they need more talent. So the two biggest things I think for this team, one, cut Rondo's minutes, because I think he's just playing altogether too much, and the team is really bad when he's on the court, especially defensively. And two, I think, is to empower some of these wing players to get more minutes, because ultimately this team is not going to win the title this year. Even if they get the 4 seed and can host a series and maybe win one, they're not getting past Houston or Golden State. But if they can figure out what works on the wing, then when the summer comes around, they could re-sign DeMarcus Cousins and then fill it out around the wing and have more of a sense of who's going to be part of the long-term picture.
Yeah, the Pelicans certainly have the lowest projected point differential among playoff teams. They're at a plus 0.09 or a plus 0.9, but 538 has them as an 82% chance to make the playoffs. I'm not sure how I feel about that, and I've spoken out about this before. I'm not sure how I feel about 538's usage of using what's the word I'm looking for, like point differential or offensive rating, net rating differential, as playing such a huge factor in the way they rate teams. But it is interesting to me that they're a little bit on the lower side, because this is a team that without Anthony Davis is absolutely a lottery team. So they sort of rise and fall on him, and they're going to continue to rise and fall on him. And this is a discussion we'll have a little bit later on as we get into the summer, as the topics become more scarce. But what they're going to do with DeMarcus Cousins, I think they have to offer him the max, and they have to try to bring him back, because they're in such a jam financially that I don't know what their other ways out of this are. But I will be interested to see how the Pelicans finish out the season because they're in fourth place right now. They could host a home playoff series. And most importantly, I think Anthony Davis might be the most unguardable player in the NBA. He's very, very difficult. We've seen him demolish 5, 6, 7 teams with these 45 and 17, 53 and 18 stat lines. So that's not a team I really want to see in the first round.
I think you're right. And the other thing to keep in mind is who is going to guard him in the Western Conference playoffs? I mean, it's Pau Gasol, Karl-Anthony Towns, Nikola Jokic. These guys are not defensive centers. Down at the bottom, you've got the Utah Jazz and the Los Angeles Clippers currently in 9th and 10th. They've got defensive centers, DeAndre Jordan, Rudy Gobert. But it's very unlikely they're going to match up with the Pelicans in the first round. So you have to go, who's going to be able to stop Davis? So if they can just get into the playoffs, I think they've got a really good shot. And even if, they end up falling a little bit, the Warriors are going to have a really hard time guarding Davis. I mean, JaVale McGee, he's the new starter up there. So I think by having big men, yes, you have other issues around the roster. But when your best player is a big and he's a dominant post player, it opens up options for you in an NBA where centers are trending smaller and smaller and rangier. And so I think that certainly gives him an advantage. If Drew Holiday can continue playing like he is, if Nikola Mirotic can bump his 3-point percentage up, he's only been shooting 31% since he got to the Pelicans. So if that gets up back to more to the 37, 38% that it has been, I think that's going to form a really good 1-2 combo in the front court. And so, again, the Pelicans are not beating the Warriors. They're not beating the Rockets, but Davis is playing incredibly well, and he may have realized this potential we've all been waiting for to finally click where he can be a top 5 player in the NBA. And if that's the case, I think a lot of the other teams in the Western Conference are going to be really, really worried if they see him on the other side of the ledger come playoff time.
All right, the next team in the Western Conference playoffs is the Minnesota Timberwolves. They're in 5th place right now. They're 38-28. They've had a little bit of a skid. They're only 4-6 over their last 10. They have not played tremendously well, and I think that probably is built on the back of one thing, missing Jimmy Butler. What do you think the outlook is for this team if they have Butler versus if they don't for the playoffs? Because I know that the projections say he'll be back, but you never know with knee injuries how long they can keep somebody out.
I think the Minnesota Timberwolves as a playoff contender rise and fall with whether or not Jimmy Butler is able to suit up. He has been their best offensive player and their best defensive player individually this season, which is crazy. I mean, there's only a handful of players in the entire league who could do that for their team. And so Butler has been incredible. I mean, that's 22.2 points per game that they're just missing, and they're having to fill in with guys who really can't handle that kind of a load. Shabazz Muhammad definitely wasn't the answer, but he makes them incredibly thin on the wing now. And they've got to play 2 point guard lineups. They've got to play Jamal Crawford at the 3. Trying to replace him is really hurting this team. And so the thing that's going to determine whether or not Jimmy Butler comes back was how his knee was treated in this cleanup surgery. So he elected reportedly to just have the meniscus basically sliced off to allow it to heal back, rather than going in surgically and repairing it. And so that's a more simple procedure. It should allow him to get back sooner, but it could mean side effects once he comes back to the court. And if Jimmy Butler comes back, 2 weeks before the end of the season, and then his knee starts swelling up and he can't be on the court every game, he can't sustain these 45-minute outings that Tibbs is going to lean on him for, I think that's really going to hurt the team. And so you have to make sure, this team has to make sure it does the right thing long-term with their star player. And I don't know if Thibodeau can do that, and that could lead to a disaster come playoffs.
Yeah, this is a team that has a tremendous amount of minutes played in their star players. You have 5 players on the roster over 30, but you have your big 3 in Jimmy Butler, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Andrew Wiggins, all over 35. Towns is playing 35, Wiggins is playing 36.1, and Butler's playing 37.1. So obviously fatigue concern down the stretch for this team. But one thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly is how well Andrew Wiggins has played in the absence of Jimmy Butler. Now, it's a small sample size, and in that small sample size, the the Timberwolves are 2-2 with wins over Chicago and Sacramento and losses to Portland and Utah. But Wiggins has really stepped into a role of being a player who can score and do a lot of other things for his team. He scored 23, 22, 21, and 27 since Butler's departure. I think there's an idea that maybe Andrew Wiggins is never going to be the player that we thought he was going to be, but it is interesting to see in Butler's absence how he seems to have grown up a little bit in that role of being not the guy, but the guy for a stretch where you need him to sort of help you out. What do you think about Wiggins right now?
I think Wiggins absolutely has stepped into that role. He's seeing himself as the replacement for Jimmy Butler. So he's been, 1A on offense. He's been handling the ball more. He's been taking more shots. And to his credit, a lot of them have been going in. And Minnesota needed someone to step up. I mean, Jamal Crawford wasn't going to suddenly, add 20 shots. So Wiggins definitely needed to step up. But here's where I think some of the problem is. When Wiggins is viewing himself as the number one option, that's taking the ball out of the hands of Karl-Anthony Towns. Now, Towns has been a distant third in usage rate on the team all season. And maybe that's okay when Butler is, scoring efficiently. But with Wiggins as the number one option, I think Towns is being pressed down in his usage unnecessarily. I think Towns is a very special offensive player and should be getting more touches, especially inside. And so we need Wiggins to step up. If the team does, the team needs Wiggins to step up to really continue to win games, which they're going to need to do because they're kind of waffling right here on the edge. But I think ultimately they need to see ways to get Towns more involved because that's how this team is going to be truly special. Now, the good thing for the Timberwolves is they've played more games than everyone else. So they've actually played 66 games thus far, and most of the other Western Conference contenders have played 62 or 63. So they've already banked wins, while Butler was playing. And I think that's going to help them, even if they're coasting down the stretch, to maintain a playoff spot.
Sort of to build on the back of that, they only have 5 games left against the other teams that are in this playoff race. They have a game against San Antonio, 2 games against Denver, Utah, and the LA Clippers. So they have a little bit of an easier time, like you said, having played more games. So it's interesting to me to see that, maybe they will, I guess, fingers crossed, be able to rest their guys down the stretch a little bit more and to get Towns more involved because when you said that, it was interesting to me because I have Towns on my fantasy team and I see these double-doubles every night, but it's a quiet double-double that he seems to put up on these low usage rates. But Minnesota is going to be one of the more interesting teams because their talent level is high, but they have a lot of factors that have worked against them through the season, and now with the Butler injury, it's going to be difficult for this team. Even though they sit in 5th place right now, they're going to have to right the ship to not back into the playoffs if they make it at all.
Yeah, Alex, I just want to point out that the next stretch is murderous for the Timberwolves. So they already started out with a loss to Portland where they seemingly could not stop Damian Lillard down the stretch no matter what they tried to do. And then they lost to the Utah Jazz in a game where Jeff Teague got himself ejected and Karl-Anthony Towns got ejected for being a little sassy. I don't even know what happened there. But that's 2 losses right there. And then they now play Boston. They play Golden State. They go to Washington, to San Antonio, and they play Houston. That's their next 5 games. You could realistically see them on a 7-game losing streak 2 weeks from now. And while that's scary sounding, the schedule gets a lot easier from there. So it's not like that's going to be a death sentence, but I think it bears watching how they perform over the next 5 games.
Yeah, I agree. Because that can make or break their season. If they come out of this stretch 0-7, obviously they're in pretty dire straits. But even 1-6, 2-5 is a pretty drastic outlook when the playoffs are separated by so few games. Now let's move on to the team that I think is the most interesting in this playoff race, and that is the 6th place San Antonio Spurs, who are 36-27. They're 2-8 over their last 10, have not played well, been up and down since the beginning of January. The Spurs have not looked like the Spurs, and there's a very good reason for that, in that they're missing their best player in Kawhi Leonard. Is there much of a discussion? We know what this team is. We know what the roster is. We can look at it and say there's not a tremendous amount of talent, but they do have Greg Popovich and they have LaMarcus Aldridge. But isn't the discussion here just Kawhi Leonard?
In a general sense, yes. But without Kawhi Leonard, this team lacks the ceiling to take down the best teams in the league, but they were still able to be successful. But without Kawhi Leonard and LaMarcus Aldridge, this team lacks the floor not to lose to any team in the league. And you saw that the other night when they lost to the Lakers in a very entertaining game as Lonzo Ball kind of showed his stuff. But the Spurs have this system where they can kind of just, no matter who they put in the lineup, they can just mow down lesser opponents, but they're struggling against teams that they would usually beat because they just don't have enough offensive firepower. Without Kawhi, without LaMarcus, Pau Gasol has been injured and in and out of the lineup. They just are really struggling. And so they've got the best coach in the group of these teams fighting for Western Conference playoff positioning. And the possibility of Kawhi Leonard returning means that this team still has hope that they could put something together. And I mean, honestly, if everybody got healthy, Kawhi Leonard came back, Aldridge was healthy, this team could push anyone in the West, not name the Warriors. So they still have that ceiling, but this Kawhi Leonard story has been so weird that you can't bank on him coming back. And if he doesn't play again this season, I don't think the Spurs realistically can finish any higher than the 7th seed.
And to build on the back of that, they have the most difficult schedule remaining of all the teams in the league, but most importantly of all the teams in this playoff race. They have to play Golden State twice. They have to play Houston twice. And then that doesn't even include that they have to play Oklahoma City twice, New Orleans, Portland twice, Portland, Minnesota, Utah, New Orleans twice. So like their schedule left is brutal. When you look at it, if you go and just sort of pull up their schedule and look at it, they have Memphis and that's about it when it comes to games. Oh, Houston. So they have Memphis and Houston that are walkover games, but every other game could be a 50-50 ball with this team. So when you look at them and you understand they have the most difficult schedule left, plus they don't have their star player, it's going to be a pretty tough row to hoe for the San Antonio Spurs.
I think you're absolutely right, and the fact of the matter is, by this point in the season, the Spurs have always banked more wins than this, and so down the stretch, they're used to resting guys to make sure they're healthy come playoff time. They don't have that luxury now. They have to push hard just to make the playoffs as it is. And they have this incredible streak. I think it's 19 straight seasons of 50 games or the equivalent for lockout seasons. That's almost out of reach at this point. The Spurs only have 36 wins. So they've got to go, 14-8 over their next, the end of the season here. And that's just a really tall task. So I think that you're going to see a different kind of Spurs team that's really got to fight its way down the stretch. And the last time the Spurs were in this kind of a scenario, it was a little bit different, but they were in basically what amounted to a 4-way tie in the Western Conference that saw them slide all the way down to 6th 3 seasons ago. And that was the great 7-game series between the Clippers and the Spurs, where Chris Paul and Blake Griffin came, just tore it up in Game 7 to win. The Spurs do not want to be without home court advantage again because they play their best at home. That's like their comfort level. And if they have to go on the road to open the playoffs, I think it's very likely they don't get out of the first round again. When that happens, then a lot of questions open up about the future of Kawhi, of LaMarcus, and honestly, even Pop himself.
Yeah, that's this team in a nutshell. We're not sure what they are. I mean, without Kawhi Leonard, we're not sure what they can be, and it seems like they're going to have a pretty difficult time going into the playoffs. Now, let's move from the team that interests me the most to the team that probably interests me the least, and that's the Oklahoma City Thunder. The Thunder are in 7th place right now. They're 37-28. They have they're 6-4 over their last 10. They've been up and down, and we know that's what they are, but I guess the number that matters the most when you talk about the Spurs, when you talk about the Thunder, at least if you ask Russell Westbrook, is their record against teams that are over 500. They have wins over Golden State. They have wins over Houston, and they seem to take care of business against good teams. But then the rest of the time, it does not look like they're taking care of business. What do you think about this team? I mean, are you going to talk me into this being an entertaining story down the stretch? Because honestly, I don't think Carmelo Anthony's even close to a top 50 player anymore. I think he's a solid third option, but not necessarily better than other third options. So I'm not tremendously entertained in what I get from Russell Westbrook and Paul George. You're going to have to talk me into it, Josh.
Well, I will say this. Russell Westbrook is incredibly entertaining to watch on the basketball court.
Right.
The way that he moves and shoots, the way he reacts to things. So it can be entertaining to watch them. Paul George is an incredible player. Steven Adams will just brutalize other players down the stretch in their tight win over the Mavericks, which why is a potential playoff team needing to go down to the wire against the Mavericks? But Steven Adams was just chucking guys out of the way to get offensive rebounds to keep them in the game there late, and they ended up pulling it out. The week before, they had needed a Russ game winner to beat the Kings. They barely beat the Grizzlies. They lost twice to the Lakers. That was all in February. So sure, they're getting these wins against good teams, but they're where they are because they're not getting wins against the bad teams, and they're going to have to do something about that down the stretch here to stay in the playoff picture. I think it's very possible this team could end up not making the playoffs, which is unfathomable from where we were at the beginning of the season, where they had two all-NBA type players in Westbrook and George, and then Carmelo slotting in. But the problem is they're desperately missing Andre Robertson. His wing defense was crucial to what this team was trying to accomplish. And missing him, they're not just missing his defensive impact. That's a hard blow in and of itself. But now they don't have a guy to put in there who can really make an impact. So they have to decide between okay offense and Alex Abrinas or okay defense and Josh Hustis. And I think Hustis has played really well, better than I would have expected. But he's not Roberson, and he's not really an offensive threat at all. And so that problem just continues to trickle down to the bench where, okay, if you put Abrinas up with the starting lineup, then who's going to score on the bench? It's not going to be Jeremy Grant. It's not going to be Hustis. Raymond Felton really has not had much stuff this year. So this team has issues from all sides, and despite the star power, they've just been shockingly mediocre. So just to give you a couple stats, in their last 15 games, they're 7-8 with a negative 2.2 net rating. That's 22nd in the league. They're the 20th best offense and the 18th best defense. So in the last quarter of the season, they've just been meh. And for a team trying to make the playoffs in such a crowded race, meh is not going to get the job done.
Now, luckily for the Oklahoma City Thunder, they hold the tiebreakers with the Utah Jazz and the LA Clippers. So now that, when it gets down to this tight schedule, those tiebreakers are going to be important. And they hold both of those. They're the only team that holds over both of the teams that are in 9th and 10th right now. So that could be pivotal to getting them into the playoffs. Who knows what that means for them beyond that. But that if you've watched this team at all, they do rise to the occasion. And I suppose I misspoke because I do love watching the Thunder, but I don't love following the Thunder because Steven Adams has to be one of the most entertaining players in the league, and how he's effective without destroying the box scores is really, really fun to watch. And you got to love Russ, and Paul George is this athletic freak. So I misspoke about how much I actually love to watch the Thunder, because when they're on, I'm flipping the TV on, but following the story for me has just been less than compelling at this point for all the reasons that you said.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I think part of it has been there's a disconnect between, how the stars are playing and how they're perceived. And so, for example, Carmelo Anthony, he's a really good NBA player who's put a really good career together, but he just doesn't have it this year.
Yep.
And but the reality is that people don't know how to discuss that without going to one end of the spectrum or the other. The reality is that Carmelo Anthony is not an elite offensive scorer anymore, and he's not absolute garbage. And apparently, people cannot come to a middle ground there. Carmelo is still a good offensive player who, in the right role, can succeed. But he's been relatively inefficient at things that used to be his calling card, namely mid-range shots. And he's shooting something in the low 20s from mid-range. And that's killing this team because there are pockets that are opening for Melo inside the arc where if he could hit shots, not on dribble and size up the defense and keep the ball away from Russ and George and Adams and, take a contested shot. But when it's wide open, when Russ dives in and then passes out and Melo can curl around a screen, and there are options available here for Melo to score points, but he's just missing shots. So is it a matter of Melo has just dropped off and it's never coming back? Or could Melo start to get his groove back? As if he can, I think that's where this team could really start to make some noise, is if Melo can start scoring efficiently and be really that third option next to Westbrook and Paul George. If that doesn't happen, I just don't see this team scoring enough to do much of anything in the playoffs if they even get there.
Yeah, I was just looking over my notes about the number of times that I've watched this team. And the thing that stands out to me, at least as I'm looking this over, is that to me, it feels like and it looks like Carmelo Anthony is not quite sure what his role is, and that's what causes the problem. I think in a lot of games, Carmelo Anthony still thinks he's the Carmelo Anthony that had that storied career that he's built on, and that takes away from the touches that primarily Paul George should be getting because he's such a more dynamic player. I worry about this team in terms of having three players who were the big dogs on their own team last year, and that's been an overarching question, and it seems to be solved sometimes, and it seems to not be solved sometimes. But to me, when the chips are down, that's going to be the big issue with this team. Now let's move on. And let's talk about the 8th place team, another really interesting team to me, and that's the Denver Nuggets. Now, our coworker and editor-in-chief, Eric Spiropoulos, he's the chief man on the Nuggets bandwagon, but at 35-28, the Nuggets are barely clinging to that 8th seed. What do you think about Denver right now?
Denver is somewhat of an enigma, and I think it's just what side of the ball you watch them on. Because if you watch them when they're going down the court to score, it's incredible. The offensive actions they're running are intelligent. The players are bought in. They seem to have this instinctual knowledge of where each other are going to be. Gary Harris and Nikola Jokic love to run the give and go. They've got great players cutting like Will Barton. Trey Lyles has been really successful when a lot of players thought that he was kind of done after a poor sophomore season. They've got tons of good offensive pieces at different levels, and that's what you need. You need a star with Nikola Jokic, who's facilitating and playmaking. Jamal Murray has been able to score and shoot the ball at a high level. You want good offensive role players. Everything is fitting together really well on that end. But the problem is that this team doesn't have good defensive personnel, like at all. It's not like, we just need to play more minutes for who? They just don't have a guy who's going to be able to step up. You kind of think about to the draft where they traded away from Donovan Mitchell, which, no one expected Mitchell to be this good. But they traded down, got Trey Lyles, and were one pick away from getting OG Anunoby. That's the kind of player, even as a rookie, who could really help this team. Because Wilson Chandler just doesn't have the same pop that he used to defensively on the wing. And there's no one else there who's able to be a stopper. Paul Millsap, he's coming back. He is an above-average defender, but he's really the only one in the rotation. And the reality, he's not guarding the best wings. So who on this team is going to guard Kevin Durant or Paul George or Kawhi Leonard come the playoffs? Gary Harris, that's not his role. He's not a lockdown guy. He's a solid team defender. So I really think the dichotomy in this team is, are you watching them on offense or are you watching them on defense? And if they can't get the defense to move a little bit towards the success of the offense, they're going to have some trouble. And I hate to say that because Eric might just fire me.
To speak to your point, they are 25th in defensive rating, according to Basketball Reference. Now, depending on Cleaning the Glass or NBA.com or Basketball Reference, wherever you get your stats, things vary a little bit. But according to Basketball Reference, they're 25th right now. Now, Josh, I have an issue with their offense that might be a little bit down the rabbit hole, but it's something I want to talk to you about. And to me, Zach Lowe touched on this, and then as I started to watch film, this became more and more apparent. This is a team that lives by the pass and dies by the pass. Now, normally when you're playing pickup ball with your buddies, when you get on that great passing team, you love that. But the one problem at an NBA level is I'm not sure they have a player that can beat you on his own. And while their offense has been this nice, beautiful, picturesque ball movement offense, when it comes playoff time and things get mucked up and jammed up by defenses like San Antonio or Golden State, not that, that's necessarily where these teams are lining up to play, but when you get these good defenses and things start to get mucked up, it's hard to play the beautiful game, and you need somebody who can get buckets. And I'm not sure who that is for this team.
That's a great question. They want it to be Jamal Murray, and he's had a splendid sophomore season here, really stepping up and following through on the potential that they saw in him when they selected him last year. But he's a little bit on the smaller side, just as a player, not necessarily as a point guard. And they don't have a wing who can really create his own shot. Will Barton is kind of more like a microwave scorer off the bench, and even in the starting lineup, that's kind of been his role. Gary Harris can score really well if he's not asked to do too much. He's the kind of guy who's going to spot up outside. He can score inside, but he's not going to just put the ball in his hands and do exactly what you were talking about, breaking down the defense. So this team definitely has an opening for that. But you kind of think maybe if Nikola Jokic continues to improve just as a facilitator, which he's already excellent. So I'm not saying necessarily get better in ability, but just get better in experience. I think this team could share the rock in a way that's been unique. And it's kind of funny that this Denver team is doing that after we kind of said that about Denver teams in the past, where they didn't necessarily have one all-NBA type player, but were just successful throughout the starting lineup. I just see a lot of potential in this group to kind of gel where there's no weakness from 1 to 5, and this team can really find success. Now, are they going to have a guy who can beat Kawhi Leonard? Maybe not, but then just go stick Wilson Chandler in the corner and, pull Kawhi Leonard out of the play. I think that strategy's been tried before. So I like this team a lot in its potential moving forward. But one thing they're really going to have to fix is the defense because I know you mentioned they're 25th in the league for the season. Over the last 15 games, they're last in the league. And that's a major problem, and we have to see if Paul Millsap's going to be able to help out there. And one other stat that I thought was unique, 538 ran a piece a couple days ago talking about which teams have been wronged by the refs the most. So basically looking like in the last 2 minutes of a game, if the score is within 3 points, looking at that ref report to see who had the most calls go against them. And the Denver Nuggets lead the league in bad calls against them. And when you include non-calls that should have been called, they're third in the whole league and first among any of the teams fighting for the playoffs in the West. So if you assume that's noise and that's just going to correct itself, that could be just maybe a small thing, but something that could help propel them into a more sure playoff spot.
Well, you've just stirred the pot for these Denver Nuggets fans who are listening right now. They're gonna be starting a Twitter riot by the end of this show. Let's move on. We've got 2 teams to go, and I know you're on a little bit of a time crunch here, so let's move on to the next team, and that's the LA Clippers. Now, the Clippers have played pretty well. They're 7-3 over their last 10. They had a nice win over Denver last week. They have played pretty well. They have played above what I guess we thought they would be, particularly after the Blake Griffin departure. What do you think about this Lou Williams-led LA Clippers squad in their hunt for the playoffs?
I think that the Clippers have been fun from this idea that you don't necessarily need, star potential, blue chip, high pedigree guys. Sure, they have DeAndre Jordan, but the Clippers have been finding success recently without any of these big stars. So Lou Williams, journeyman player, he's just been fun to watch. Now, do I think that's going to be able to survive in the playoffs? I don't really know. And I tend to think that no, he's not going to be able to sustain that same level of play if they make it to the playoffs. But right now, it's a lot of fun. And the other cool thing about this team is that they keep getting these big performances from just random players. So, Montrezl Harrell, their third string center, will suddenly show up and just have a really big game. Or against the Nuggets, Boban Marjanovic, NBA Twitter's favorite son, destroyed the Nuggets, and he was seemingly unstoppable inside. And so that's been a lot of fun to watch. So this team has been very likable, but I don't know that's going to translate into any sort of success either down the stretch to get in the playoffs or in the postseason itself.
I really like this team in the way they've reshaped. I'm not sure if they're going to make the playoffs. I'm not sure what that means, but I do like their mental toughness. And with players like Lou Williams, with Montrezl Harrell, with particularly with Pat Beverly, who's out for the season for them, this is going to be a fun roster next year, and seeing what they're going to be able to shape this into, because this is one of those teams where, you hear people talk about all the time that it's not bad to be in the middle, and this team is in the middle, and they have a lot of interesting pieces. I don't know how much I want them to be in the playoffs. I think they're probably just a cut below talent-wise, so I don't know that I want to watch them get swept by the Rockets or the Warriors. I would probably much rather see the Nuggets, the Jazz, the Thunder, whoever's in that 8 seed besides them. So this probably puts them last on what I want personally to happen. But going forward, I really like the way this roster is constructed and what they're going to be able to do in the future. So hopefully they can, gather some pieces. They have 2 picks that are pretty close to mid-lottery picks this year. And so they're going to be able to add to this core pretty nicely.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And they certainly have upside moving forward. And you have to see how they're going to use their cap space and what are they going to do with kind of these role players. Who are they going to keep? Who are they going to move? And one of those role players has been Tyrone Wallace. And I think they're really going to miss him. His 45 days just ran out on his two-way contract, despite the team doing everything they could to stretch those days. The Clippers would force him to fly out the morning of a game commercial rather than fly on the team charter the day before, so that travel day was the same as his game day, and he didn't have to waste 2 of his 45 days, which that's good, management as far as maximizing that. But it really kind of yanked him around. And so he played really hard. He gave him exceptional minutes despite having to fly out these special times and not be able to train with the team and so on and so forth. He played in 21 games for the Clippers. He averaged over 27 minutes a game and scored in a double-figure average. And defensively, he was really tough and really filled a need for them, especially before they added, some players in Avery Badley and Tobias Harris to kind of help out on the wing. And so what they decided to do was lowball him to give him a contract. He turned it down, which I think makes sense. I think he earned a real contract offer this summer. And so the Clippers just let him go back down to the G League. And so he'll be there and this summer be able to sign with another team. And so to replace him, they signed Sean Kilpatrick, who I just don't think can have the same level of impact. And so ultimately, not because of Tyrone Wallace leaving, but just the fact that they've gotten above average production from players who just can't sustain it, I think they're the most likely of all these teams to miss out on the playoffs.
2 more names to throw in there. I really like both their rookies this year, Juwan Evans and Sindarius Thornwell. Neither one of them have gotten tremendous minutes, but they have been very, very productive in what minutes they have gotten. So this is a roster that is going to be interesting. Let's move on to the last team that I find to be one of the really exciting stories about this, because it's a question of how far this team can rise, and that's the Utah Jazz. Now they're in 10th place right now. They're 33-30. They've only played 63 games, so they're behind in that count with a lot of teams. But they're a team that has played really, really, really well over the past month. They have, they lost twice in February, and then they've won twice in March. So that puts them to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 12-2 over their last 14. And then if you stretch that back, they're like 17-2 since January 24th. So this is a team that's played really, really well. And obviously, we're going to talk about Donovan Mitchell, who has been put his name into the Rookie of the Year discussion. And then the other person that you have to talk about is Joe Ingles. Joe Ingles has seemingly come out of nowhere and been probably the best role player in the NBA this year.
Yeah, Ingles has been great. Jingle Joe, as they call him there in Utah, has been balling out, and in 2 major ways. One is from three-point range. He's been scorching hot, 44% for the season. And during that win streak, he was up over 50 from 3. And it's not just on low volume either. I mean, he's hitting 2, 3, 4, 6. He was 6 of 9 from long range in a crucial win over the Trailblazers earlier last month. I mean, Ingles has been playing really well, and that contract could have looked questionable back in the summer when Gordon Hayward left. I think he's proving his worth right now, and maybe by the end of it, we could be saying something different, but right now he's absolutely earning his paycheck. And Donovan Mitchell has been great too. He's leading this team in minutes. He's leading them by far in field goal attempts, in scoring. He's been passing the ball. He's been fighting for rebounds. He's been one of the best swipers of balls as far as steals in the entire league. Mitchell's been incredible, and a huge find for them at 13 because this Jazz team has been too good to truly bottom out and rebuild. And so they haven't been able to get that top tier talent, but being able to fill in the roster and having success from a guy like Mitchell, they took at 13, and Rudy Gobert, their best player, who they got in the late first. And so this team has been a lot of fun as they've kind of fought their way back into the mix. And so 538, interestingly, has them outside the playoffs in projected winning record. They think that they're going to be the 9th seed, but they actually have them rated as the 6th best team in the league. So it's mainly just a fact of where they're starting from, having to fight all the way back up. But I will point out, Utah has the easiest schedule remaining of any of these teams, and one of the easiest in the entire league. And so that's going to give them the opportunity that if they can continue to play well, to rack up the easy wins and fight their way right back into the playoffs.
I really liked this team, and I love Quinn Snyder, and I feel like I don't get to talk about enough how much I feel like the Utah organization develops these young players, finds these young players, and brings them along, because like you said, when you look at it, even if you go back to Gordon Hayward, you've got Donovan Mitchell, you've got Rudy Gobert, you've got Derek Favors, all these guys who were either drafted by the organization or came to the organization at a very young age, and how they've developed them into quality players. And even this season, with Mitchell and also with Royce O'Neal adding another young guy to the, that they basically picked off the scrap heap. This is a fantastic organization. And I feel like because they're in a small market, they sort of get overlooked. But the thing I wanted to talk about is the additions that they've made this year. They added Ricky Rubio from Minnesota in a trade earlier this year. And Rubio's been up and down, but lately he's played pretty well. This is a guy who has not been a tremendous shooter through his career, but he tends to make big shots for this team. And then the other guy that and you may call me a little biased on this, but I think Jay Crowder, the addition of Jay Crowder brings this mental toughness, this wing defender that they've so needed throughout the year. And to pair him with Donovan Mitchell and with Rudy Gobert, this is a potent defensive lineup, and they're in third place when it comes to defensive rating right now, or points per game. They're in fourth place in defensive rating. This is a team that can slow the ball down, grind it out, and win those 96, 91 games that we so rarely see anymore that become important in the playoffs.
Yeah, defense is this team's calling card for sure. And that starts with the best defensive player in the league, Rudy Gobert, inside. And so obviously he's missed a lot of time this year. And I think that's why Utah dropped out of the playoff picture, because if he had been healthy all year, I think they would be solidly in the playoffs. And honestly, I think they'd probably be the third seed just with how the season's gone for everyone else. But, that's just a wish. Rudy Gobert has only played in 37 games. And so that has kept the Jazz down. But I think that he is leading the charge for dominant defense. And when you have a guy like Rudy Gobert at center, you've got wing defenders like Jay Crowder and Joe Ingles on the wings. And you've got a long long-limbed guards like Donovan Mitchell and Ricky Rubio. That's just the blueprint for a really successful defense. And over the last 15 games, where the Jazz are 13-2, they have by far the best defensive rating in the league at 98.7, which is an incredibly low number in the modern NBA, where offenses continue to tick more and more efficient. And so they probably won't be quite that good the rest of the way, but they have the pieces to do so. And I think if they can make defense their calling card, the cupcakes that they're playing coming up just aren't going to be able to score on them. So if you look at the next month, they get to play the Magic, they get to play the Grizzlies twice, they get to play the Suns, they get to play the Kings, they get to play the Hawks, they get to play the Mavericks. Basically, this team can single-handedly decide the tank race just because of how many of them they're playing. And even games against more established opponents, they get to play the Pistons at home, they get to play the Pacers on the road. These aren't necessarily teams that are like dominant contenders. Really, they've got a game against the Celtics, a game against the Warriors. Those are really the only two games left this month that are really scary at all. So
right, and they play the Warriors.
Jazz,
they play the Warriors on the second to last game. They play them on the 25th, but they also play them on April 10th, which does not necessarily mean you're playing the Warriors. So that game can be deceptive even when it comes to strength of schedule. Probably another easy win for this team if they're playing with their full contingent of players.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the schedule really seems to be unfolding itself well for Utah down the stretch. And I think what that means is I know they're behind. They're multiple games out of the playoffs, but really they're probably the team in this mix I'm feeling best about as far as moving forward. Now, will that be enough to make up the lost ground? Maybe, maybe not. But for me, I think Utah is going to make it back into the playoff picture, and they're going to ultimately qualify for the postseason.
All right, Josh, I'm going to put you on the spot in the last minute of this podcast and say, who are your two that are out right now?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question. I think that I could see any team here other than Portland missing the playoffs. I think Portland's banked enough wins. They're up in the third spot, and there's no obvious reason for regression there. So I think Portland's there. Honestly, any of these other 7 teams could miss. You figure if Jimmy Butler – I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I was going to tell you that if you put me on the spot right now, I would say Minnesota and the LA Clippers were my two, but I don't feel good about it, just like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's nuts. The Minnesota Timberwolves are going to miss. I mean, they were handily in the third spot. We were talking about whether they could push the Warriors and the Rockets, and then Jimmy Butler goes down, and that's killer for a team when you lose your best player. And because of that, I think the Timberwolves and the Spurs, if they can get their star player back, should be fine. But if they don't for the rest of the season, it's going to be very worrisome. The Thunder are a mess, but I still believe in some of the talent there as well. And I think they've got enough games already played at a high level that, their schedule down the stretch won't kill them. So really, I think it's, can Utah play enough games to overtake the Clippers and the Pelicans? And I think ultimately they will, which kills me because Anthony Davis has been incredible, and I absolutely want to see him in the postseason. But I think their blueprint over the last couple of weeks has been Anthony Davis, go be Shaquille O'Neal, or go be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, go be in a Hall of Fame center every single night, and we'll do enough around you to win. I don't think that's sustainable enough. And so if it was, they're the 4 seeds, so they've got like a 5-game lead, yeah, sure. But they're a game and a half out of 8 and 2 games out of 9th. And so I think ultimately they're going to slide down enough. And man, it kills me to say this, but I think Anthony Davis will miss the playoffs.
That is a tough call. Well, Josh Cornelissen, writer for Hoops Habit, writer for 94 Feet Report. Thanks for joining us, man. Is there anything you want to get a plug in before you go? I mean, like the Swingmen or something?
So there's this pretty cool show with a pretty cool producer and a fun group of guys that talks intelligent basketball each and every week. So catch us on Fridays, around lunchtime. This past week, we got into the Rookie of the Year. We got into the MVP race. We always take the hot topics as well as trying to go next level. So definitely check out the Swingmen. Definitely subscribe to both podcasts put out by the 94 Feet Report. A lot of really smart guys, and there's a ton of great pieces coming out, both about the NBA draft, upcoming playoffs, and everything in between. So make sure to just check out all the content being produced by 94 Feet Report.
Eric, this is a company man. Get this guy a raise. Did you hear those plugs? All right, Josh, thanks for coming on, man. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be a part of this, and we'll talk to you later, okay?
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Alex.
All right, see you, man. Special thanks to my guest, Josh Cornelissen, for joining me today and taking time out of his busy schedule. Make sure to follow him on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at AlexWestNBA. You can follow the podcast at And1 Analytics. And you can follow the 94 Feet Report at the 94 Feet Report, as well as 94feetreport.com. They're fantastic writers, as Josh said, who are doing a lot of tremendous work. There's a good deal of coverage on the day-to-day NBA. And we also have a segment of the website dedicated solely to draft coverage, headed up by our man Patrick Oxford, friend of the podcast. So make sure and check all of that out and just stay on top of everything that's going on in the NBA with the 94 Feet Report. Until next time for the And1 podcast, I'm your host, Alex West. Good night.